The official record begins with a date, October 14th, 2011. Big Cypress Reservation, Hendry County, Florida. A missing person report had been filed 2 days prior by the family of a 37-year-old man, a member of the Panther clan of the Seminole tribe of Florida, who had not returned from a solo fishing trip into the interior swamp. The report was logged with the Seminole Tribe of Florida Police Department at 6:42 in the morning and forwarded to the Bureau of Indian Affairs Field Office in Okeechobee by noon the same day. A search and rescue operation was authorized within 24 hours. The terrain designated for search was a 47-square-mile section of the Big Cypress Swamp lying southeast of the reservation's main residential cluster, accessible by a single unpaved service road that terminated approximately 3 miles from the search perimeter. The area is characterized by dense bald cypress stands, standing water averaging 18 to 36 inches in depth across most of the interior, and a canopy coverage so complete in certain grid sections that aerial observation is functionally useless during wet season. The official after-action report, filed November 2, 2011, under Bureau of Indian Affairs Field Incident Designation 947, Florida 0031, describes a 9-day search operation, a suspended recovery effort, and a case status of open and inactive. It lists equipment deployed, it lists personnel hours, it lists the grid sections covered and the grid sections not covered. What it does not list is this. On the final morning of the operation, as the team packed their equipment and prepared to leave the search perimeter, 3 members of the team reported, separately, that something at the eastern tree line had been watching them. Not something they heard, something they saw. That detail does not appear anywhere in the official record.
This is the account of the person who was standing there when they said it. My name is Daniel Osiola. I served as Search and Rescue Coordinator for the Seminole Tribe of Florida Department of Emergency Services for 14 years, from 1998 through 2012. My role was operational oversight of ground search efforts on reservation lands, which included Big Cypress, Brighton, and the smaller land parcels in Broward and Miami-Dade counties. I had coordinated or co-coordinated 31 search operations before October of 2011. I was the senior ground coordinator for the operation described in that report. I came to know what I am going to tell you through direct observation, through the statements of 3 colleagues I have known for years, and through a conversation with a Seminole elder that took place 6 days after the operation was suspended. I did not speak publicly about any of this for 11 years. I spoke to my supervisor once. I was advised to let the file stand as written. What changed is that the elder I spoke to passed away in the spring of 2022. Before he died, he told me he had released me from the condition he had placed on my silence. He said the land had already made its own record. He said it was time for the human record to catch up. I have not returned to the southeastern interior of Big Cypress since October 22, 2011. The Big Cypress Swamp does not look the way most people imagine a swamp. There is no single body of open water. It is a sheet flow system, which means the water moves across the entire landscape as a slow, nearly invisible current, a few inches deep in the dry season and shin to knee deep through most of October. The bald cypress trees grow in strands, dense corridors of timber that rise 60 to 70 feet and block horizontal sight lines completely in every direction.
Between the strands are open prairies of sawgrass and muley grass, and in certain sections, hardwood hammocks that sit slightly elevated on limestone outcroppings, dry enough to camp on. The nearest paved road to our search perimeter was State Road 833, 11 miles to the west. The nearest structure of any kind was a tribe-operated water control station 4.5 miles north of our base camp. Our team for this operation was 7 people. Marcus Billy was my deputy coordinator, 8 years in emergency services, former firefighter. Sandra Johns handled radio communications and documentation. Frank Tiger and Raymond Cypress were our primary ground searchers, both of them hunters who had worked these specific swamp sections their entire lives. We had 2 contracted searchers from a Broward County volunteer organization, a man named Pete Alvarez and a woman named Carol Dean. And we had a tribal liaison officer, a younger man named Cody Jumper, whose role was to maintain communication with the missing man's family and with tribal council. We ran a standard grid search protocol. Each day, teams of 2 moved through assigned sections, marking waypoints with fluorescent orange stakes, logging observations every 15 minutes by radio to Sandra at base camp. We carried handheld global positioning devices, topographic maps printed at 1 to 24,000 scale, water purification equipment, and enough food and fuel for 12 days. Base camp was established on a hardwood hammock approximately 1 mile inside the service road terminus. Dry ground, maybe a 1/4 acre of it, slightly elevated. It was the same hammock the tribe's emergency services unit had used as a camp base 3 times before. The cypress strand that marked the eastern boundary of our search grid ran parallel to the camp, beginning about 300 meters to our east. That tree line was the last thing I looked at every evening before I went to sleep.
I want you to remember that. The 4th day of the search was the first day something felt different. Frank Tiger brought it up first, at the radio check-in at 1400 hours. He and Raymond Cypress had been working Grid Section 7, the southernmost portion of our search area, and Frank said the birds had stopped. Not quieted, stopped. He was specific about this in his log entry. He noted that the section had been audibly active during their first pass at 0900 hours, that he had identified by sound at least 4 separate bird species, including a pair of sandhill cranes he had heard calling from the southeast. By 11:30, when they entered the deep interior of Section 7, the sound had ceased entirely, not gradually. Between one waypoint and the next, a distance of approximately 400 meters, the ambient noise disappeared. Frank had 30 years of experience in this swamp. He wrote in the log that in 30 years he had heard this kind of silence twice. Both times, he noted, there had been a large alligator in the immediate area that the birds were responding to. He offered this explanation himself. He was not troubled enough to call it in verbally. It appeared as a written notation in the field log, 3 lines, matter of fact. Raymond Cypress confirmed the observation when I debriefed him that evening. He said the same thing Frank said. He also said the silence lasted for the rest of their working day in that section. I noted it in my coordinator's log. I wrote, "Possible large reptile presence in Section 7. Bird activity suppressed. No visual confirmation. No impact on search protocol." I believed Frank's explanation. I had no reason not to. But I wrote down the time the silence started, 11:22. And I wrote down the time Frank and Raymond exited Section 7 at end of day, 16:45. 5 hours and 23 minutes of silence in a swamp that does not go quiet.
I did not know what to do with that number, so I left it in the log and went to sleep. There is a name in the Seminole tradition for certain areas of Big Cypress. Not all areas, specific ones. The word in Miccosukee, the language still spoken by a significant portion of the Seminole tribe of Florida, is a compound term. The most accurate functional translation I was given was rendered as a place where something watches from a fixed position. Not a spirit location in the religious sense, not a ceremonial site. a geographic designation that describes a behavioral characteristic of the location itself. I learned this through Cody Jumper, our tribal liaison, on the 5th day of the search. Cody was 26 years old at the time. He had grown up on the reservation, and he had heard the designation applied to certain areas by older clan members, but he had never been given the formal explanation. He told me he had mentioned our grid area to his grandmother the night before during a phone call, and she had told him to contact the tribe's cultural preservation office in the morning before we went back in. He did. He reached a man named Solomon Billy, no relation to Marcus. Solomon Billy was 71 years old at that time, a clan elder of the Bird Clan, and had served as cultural liaison to the Seminole tribe of Florida Tribal Council for 22 years. He held a formal role in the tribe's land stewardship process, which meant he was the person whose signature was required when any external agency sought access to certain designated areas for research or resource extraction. Solomon Billy agreed to speak with me by phone that afternoon. He told me the area designated in our search grid, specifically the southeastern section running along that eastern cypress strand, had carried a formal avoidance designation in the tribe's internal land records for at least 4 generations. He was careful to tell me this was not a religious prohibition.
It was not a burial site. It was not sacred ground in the way that term is commonly understood. He said the distinction mattered. He said belief is what individuals carry. Protocol is what institutions write down. This, he said, was protocol. It had been written down. It had been passed from one cultural officer to the next for as long as the written record in the tribe's archive extended, which he estimated at slightly over 100 years. Before the written record, he said, it had been transmitted verbally for considerably longer. He would not tell me on that phone call what the area was designated for avoidance because of. He said that was a conversation for in person, and only if I came to him after the operation was finished. He did agree to tell me one thing. He said the designation was not about what lived there permanently. He said it was about what came there when there was activity. The 6th night of the operation was the first night we found evidence at base camp. Pete Alvarez had been on equipment maintenance duty that afternoon, which meant checking the fuel reserves for the 2 portable generators, logging the inventory of food and water, and ensuring the orange marker stakes were sorted and bundled for the next day's grid work. It was a routine he had performed every 3rd day of the operation. He finished at approximately 17:30 and left the equipment staging area to join the rest of the team for the evening meal. We ate. We ran the 900-hour radio check-in with Sandra. We went to sleep. At 0600 the following morning, Pete went back to the staging area to begin the morning equipment check. He came to find me immediately. 2 bundles of orange marker stakes had been moved, not scattered, not knocked over by wind or an animal pressing through the camp, moved. They had been placed on their sides in the water at the eastern edge of the hammock, arranged with the pointed ends facing the same direction, facing east.
Toward the cypress strand. I documented this at 0622. I photographed the stakes with the team's field camera. I measured the distance from their original position, which Pete confirmed from memory, and which matched the previous day's inventory sketch to their current position, 14 meters. Across dry ground, then into approximately 4 inches of standing water at the hammock's edge. There were no tracks in the mud at the waterline that belonged to any member of our team. I checked every boot sole in camp against the impressions. None matched. There was one set of impressions I could not account for. They did not look like a boot. They did not look like any animal I could identify from the shape, and I have spent enough time in this swamp to recognize the track signature of every species that lives in it. The impressions were spaced at irregular intervals, deeper at the outer edges than the center, and they sank 31 millimeters into soil that held my own boot, a size 11, at 9 millimeters. I measured 3 times, 31 millimeters. Frank Tiger looked at the impressions for a long time without speaking. When he spoke, He said only that he did not know what made them. This was the first time in 8 years of working with Frank that he had said those words about any track. I radioed Sandra and asked her to log an equipment anomaly at base camp. I did not describe it further on the radio. I wrote the full account in my coordinator's log by hand. That evening, I positioned my sleeping gear so that I faced the eastern tree line. I had been looking at it every night since we arrived. That night, for the first time, I had the feeling something was looking back. The 8th day. Raymond Cypress and Carol Deneen were assigned to Grid Section 9, the northernmost section of our search area, adjacent to the eastern Cypress Strand. They had worked this section once before, on day 3, without incident.
Their assignment was a second pass sweep, looking for anything the first pass had missed. At 11:04, Raymond called in on the radio. His voice was even. He was a man who did not raise his voice under any circumstances, and this was no exception. He said he and Carol had found something in Section 9 that he wanted me to come look at in person. He said it was not the missing man. He said it was not an emergency. He said I should bring the field camera. I walked to Section 9 with Marcus. It took us 40 minutes through knee-deep water and 2 cypress strand crossings. Raymond was standing at the base of a pond cypress at the interior edge of the strand, the same strand that ran along our eastern boundary. Carol was standing 10 feet away from him, facing the other direction. She did not turn around when we arrived. I noted this, but said nothing. The tree Raymond was standing beside had a mark on its bark. Not a cut, not a scrape from an animal, not lightning damage or rot. A mark. It ran from approximately 4 feet above the waterline to approximately 8.5 feet above the waterline. My measurement the following morning, after I returned with a measuring rod, confirmed 8 feet 4 inches of vertical extent. The mark was pressed into the bark, not carved, as if something had run its surface along the trunk with sustained pressure. The bark was not broken, but was compressed in a continuous line. At the midpoint of the mark, there was a single horizontal pressure point, an indentation, oval, roughly the size of my palm, but deeper than any pressure I could generate by pushing directly into the bark with both hands. I tried. I could not replicate it. I photographed the mark from 6 angles. I sketched it in the field log with measurements. I collected a bark sample at the indentation point and sealed it in an evidence bag, following standard protocol, tagging it with the date, grid reference, and my initials. I looked at Raymond.
He said he had heard something moving in the strand for about 20 minutes before he found the tree. A consistent sound, he said, not rushing or crashing, slow, deliberate, like something that was not trying to move quietly, but was not in a hurry either. Then the sound stopped. Then he found the tree. I asked where Carol was when he found it. He said she had been directly behind him, maybe 15 feet. I asked if she had seen anything. Raymond looked toward Carol, who was still standing with her back to us. He said she had. I walked to Carol. I stood beside her and asked her what she had seen. She said she had seen it step behind a cypress about 60 meters into the strand. I asked her to describe it. She said it was upright. She said it was tall. She said she had triangulated it against a tree she was standing next to, a slash pine at the section boundary with a trunk fork at approximately 9 feet. She said the top of what she saw cleared that fork. She said it did not move the way a person moves. She said it stopped at the tree and stood behind it. She said it did not move again. She said she watched for 4 minutes. She said she counted. I asked her what happened at 4 minutes. She said she stopped watching because she felt she was being permitted to watch, and she did not want to be permitted anymore. We left Section 9. I walked back through the water with Raymond on one side of me and Marcus on the other. Carol walked behind us. None of us spoke for the entire 40 minutes back to camp. The eastern tree line ran alongside us the entire way. That is the same tree line I had been looking at from camp every single night. That is the tree line described in no official document that was ever filed. On October 22, 2011, we were told by the Bureau of Indian Affairs field contact to suspend the operation. 9 days in, no recovery, weather window closing. Standard procedure for a case of this type in terrain of this difficulty.
We broke camp the morning of October 23rd. It took us 3 hours to pack the equipment, load the vehicles staged at the service road terminus, and do a final sweep of the hammock to ensure we had left nothing behind. This was also standard. We had done it at the end of every previous operation. At 09:40, we were ready to move. Marcus Billy, Frank Tiger, and Raymond Cypress all stopped at the same moment. I was facing the vehicles. I turned around. All 3 of them were looking at the eastern tree line. I looked. At the edge of the strand, where the cypress trees thinned enough to allow a horizontal sight line of roughly 40 meters before the canopy closed it off, there was something standing, upright, still. We stood there for what I estimate was 90 seconds. Marcus later said 2 minutes. Frank said he did not time it. Then it stepped back into the tree line, and it was gone. No sound, no movement of branches, no birds lifting from the canopy, just gone. We got in the vehicles, we drove out. Nobody spoke until we reached State Road 833. Frank Tiger said when we reached the pavement, it was watching to make sure we left. That is the detail that appears in no official report. The Bureau of Indian Affairs Field Office in Okeechobee issued its formal after-action assessment on November 2, 2011 under Field Incident Designation 947 Florida 0031. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission contributed a supplementary environmental assessment filed under their case reference Florida Wildlife Commission 11 Hendry County 0086. The Bureau of Indian Affairs document is 14 pages. It covers personnel, equipment, methodology, grid coverage, and conclusions. The conclusion section is 4 paragraphs. It describes the operation as thorough, given terrain limitations, notes the non-recovery outcome, and recommends case status as open and inactive pending any new physical evidence or witness information. The word observation appears once in the document. It refers to aerial observation of the search perimeter on day 2 by a contracted aircraft. I submitted my coordinator's log to the Bureau of Indian Affairs field contact on October 27, 2011. It included every entry I have described here: the track measurements, the stake displacement, the bark mark dimensions, the bark sample, the statements from Raymond Cypress and Carol Dean, the departure observation made by Marcus Billy, Frank Tiger, and Raymond Cypress on the final morning. On November 15th, I received a call from the Bureau of Indian Affairs field contact, a man I will not name here. He told me that my log had been reviewed. He told me that the items I had documented as anomalies had been assessed as consistent with known wildlife activity in the area. He told me the bark sample had been received but not yet processed. He told me my coordinator's report would be retained in the case file. He then told me, and I am rendering his words as accurately as I can from memory, that for the integrity of the case record, it would be appropriate for the coordinator's summary to reflect the official assessment language rather than field speculation. I asked him what that meant. He said it meant that the departure observation should not appear in any summary document I submitted to the case file. I told him it was already in my field log. He said field logs were supplementary materials, not primary record documents. I asked him if the bark sample had been logged into evidence. There was a pause. He said he would follow up on that. I never received a follow-up.
I contacted the Bureau of Indian Affairs field office twice more, in January and March of 2012.
Both times I was told the case was inactive and that evidence from inactive cases was held in storage pending case review. I contacted the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission directly in February of 2012 and asked about the bark sample. The documentation coordinator I spoke to had no record of it having been received. There was one person who tried to carry this further. Cody Jumper, our tribal liaison, filed a formal inquiry through the Seminole Tribe of Florida Tribal Council's legal office in December of 2011, asking for a status report on the physical evidence collected during the operation. The inquiry was forwarded to the Bureau of Indian Affairs regional office in Nashville. Cody received a response in April of 2012, acknowledging the inquiry and stating that a review was being conducted. He never received a follow-up either. He told me about this in a phone call. He said he did not know whether to be angry or unsurprised. He said he had decided on unsurprised. I spoke to Solomon Billy in person for the first time 6 days after the operation was suspended. I drove to the reservation and we sat outside his home for 2 hours. He served coffee. He asked me to describe everything in order, and I did. When I finished, he was quiet for a while. He told me the designation given to that area of the southeastern interior was not a warning about danger precisely. He said the tribe had understood for generations that whatever used that area did not behave unpredictably. It behaved with what he called consistent intention. It watched, it assessed, it marked, and when it was satisfied that the people in its territory understood the boundary, it allowed them to leave. He said the fact that we were all permitted to drive out on October 23rd was, in his understanding, not a matter of luck.
He said the question that had never been answered in any of the generational accounts he had inherited with his role was what happened when a group entered that area and did not understand the boundary. He said he believed the man we had been searching for had not understood the boundary. He did not say this as a conclusion. He said it as the only explanation he had been left with after everything else had been considered. He then told me that he was releasing me from speaking about this publicly for as long as he was alive, and that when he was gone, I would know what to do. I am speaking now because Solomon Billy passed in March of 2022. He was 81 years old. I have not entered the southeastern interior of Big Cypress since October 23, 2011. I still hold my emergency services certification. I have coordinated searches on every other section of reservation land in the years since. I have not been asked to return to that grid, and I have not volunteered. The question I carry is the one Solomon Billy named. What it was waiting to determine, about us, about the man we were searching for, about whoever enters that section of the swamp, I do not know. I was not given that information. I am not certain it can be given. What I am withholding is the specific grid coordinates of the Section 9 tree where Carol Dean watched it step behind the cypress. I have those coordinates in my original field log. I am not releasing them. I was asked not to release them by Cody Jumper, who still lives on the reservation, and I consider that request binding. Bureau of Indian Affairs Field Incident 947, Florida 0031, is still listed as open and inactive on the agency's public case index. The bark sample is not listed anywhere. The eastern tree line is still there.
And whatever assessed us from it in October of 2011 has had, by my count, more than 14 years to observe whoever else has entered that grid since we left. I have no information on whether anyone has.